Rana Mitter, you're Professor of the History and Politics of Modern China at the University of Oxford, and today we're going to talk about China, its relationship with Russia, its relationship with America. What are you going to tell me?
I hope we can talk, Kiran, about the way in which China and Russia have had, actually for quite a long period, quite an ambivalent relationship in which they're friends, they're partners, but they also don't quite trust each other, and how that's playing out. I want to talk about China's economy as well. I think that that's one of the big global stories at the present moment. Post-COVID, China is desperately trying to get its growth rate back to be able to actually provide that middle-class lifestyle for its people. And I'd also like to talk a little bit about that COVID crisis that was, of course, the biggest story in the world out of China. Now it seems to have almost disappeared now that those regulations have been ended just a few months ago. But how are things going off the back of that? And is it really the case that those regulations are never going to come back?
Rana Mitter, I want to start by discussing how China marked the one-year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine with their sort of 12-point plan of peace. It sort of spoke a lot of generals about avoiding nuclear war, of all the parties staying rational and exercising constraint. But it also did discuss and warned about expanding military blocs, which some people saw as a sort of nod to accusations of NATO expansion, I guess. Why do you think they had this 12-point plan for peace? Is it a genuine attempt at trying to be some sort of broker when it comes to this war?
I think, Kiran, that one of the reasons that China felt that it had to put forward some kind of peace plan is that expectations have been growing on China ever since it decided it was going to take a more active role in the world. And really, in the last 5 years or so, since Xi Jinping took what was his second term, he's now in his third, but during his second term, he made a very clear statement that China had a message for the world, not just for its own country. And that involved issues such as looking for green growth, looking for greater economic expansion. But of course, if you're going to pose as a global citizen, you can't do that without actually having to have an opinion on some of the biggest crises in the world. And the reason I think that they wanted to put out this plan was to get on the front foot, because the Ukraine crisis, the Russian invasion, has put China in a very difficult position, because it's trying to juggle two things at once. One is the fact that the violation of Ukraine's sovereignty is actually a big no-no for China. One of the very few things in the world they have an absolute general red line on is an internationally recognized borders being crossed, because it happened in the early 20th century to their borders so much. But at the same time, they really have become very close to Russia in terms of policy and strategy, particularly against the United States. So those two imperatives run up against each other. And that's, I think, why they put out this plan as a way of trying to answer criticism that they were trying to ride two horses at once, as the Chinese would say in one of their proverbs.
What can we therefore learn from that 12-point plan about what a world under sort of Beijing's ideology would look like?
I think, first of all, Kiran, it's important to understand that when Beijing talks about having more influence in the world, and it does, it's not thinking about it in the way that either the United States or the Soviet Union did in the old Cold War. In other words, the idea that countries are going to change their systems and reinvent themselves so they can become either free liberal democracies, in the case of the US as they would like to see themselves, or people's democratic dictatorships in the way in which the Soviet Union like to talk about this. China makes a big deal of saying we don't interfere with people's political systems. And indeed, most of their influence tends to be economic in the main part, but also a certain amount, particularly in maritime issues, tends to be more military. But economics is really the big strategy in that sense. So what would the world look like if they were going more in the direction that the peace plan suggests? Well, I think that one thing that is clear is that overall, one of the things that they are willing to do is to essentially put out for their ideological partners, by which I mean countries that also prefer an illiberal system of government like Russia. Now, Russia's system is not the same as China's. China still has a very well-embedded communist party as its ruling entity, whereas in some senses, Russia is really more of a kind of one-person organization with Putin. But the idea that essentially people should concentrate on economic well-being and not be so concerned about civil liberties, that's certainly a direction of travel that you can see in China's intention. But there is one other point that I think is genuinely interesting in the peace plan that's been put forward. And that's the statement that nuclear wars should not be attempted or fought. Now, I think, we can't be absolutely sure, but I think that this really is one signal that's being sent to their friend, Vladimir Putin. Putin has spoken more than once about nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, maybe not being off the agenda in the Ukraine conflict. And I think that this is a signal, not entirely a subtle one, but certainly not spelled out explicitly, that if there's one thing that China really isn't going to tolerate, that would be the use of nuclear weapons.
Given the fact that the US is warning that potentially China could start providing weapons to Russia for their war in Ukraine, how does that fit?
Well, I think one of the things that's emerged just in the last few hours and certainly days is that the United States is being a little more specific about where they think China is thinking at the moment. And they have actually been pulling back slightly and saying that they're not convinced at the moment that China is sending weapons. It's just that they want to make it very, very clear that they really don't want China to do that. I think also when force was being talked about, it was equipment such as drones, which of course China has particular interest in, rather than necessarily rifles or cannon or those sorts of classic types of weaponry. But I think that beyond that, there is also this sense that China wants to remake the world in ways that essentially fit that overall economic and political goal that they put forward. So to some extent, they are not concerned with whether or not Ukraine is under Russian control or whether it has its own government, as well as that government essentially follows economic ends that China is keen to pursue. Before the war started, so just over a year ago, the single country which had the largest trading relationship with Ukraine was China. The EU as a whole actually had a larger relationship. But in terms of single countries, Beijing was certainly a very, very trusted and I think practical partner in that sense. I think that what they don't want to happen is any kind of humiliation of Russia. And that's why the peace plan they put forward, in a sense, has an awful lot of rather bland statements. But one thing that is argued is that it should include a ceasefire. The ceasefire, from the Chinese point of view, is a shrewd piece of positioning because it puts forward the idea, at least ostensibly, that China's interested in peace, in people laying down their weapons above all. But I think most analysts, including in China, would admit that if there were a ceasefire right now, it probably would give an advantage to Russia rather than Ukraine, and the Chinese probably wouldn't regret that.
Is Beijing frustrated with Russia and what's been going on this past year?
I think that there are certainly hints, and we just don't have the inside information, but we have hints that just over a year ago, during the Beijing Winter Olympics, that there was some indication to Beijing's leadership from the Russians that something would happen in Ukraine. And I think most people think that was probably a hint that the eastern part of Ukraine, Donetsk, Luhansk, these parts would be perhaps attacked or taken quite soon. And China may or may not have expressed a view about that. They certainly have never, even to this day, publicly approved the invasion. Even at the UN, they've abstained rather than voting in favor of Russia. But one can imagine that there might have been a message going out that was along the lines of, well, if you're going to go and do this, but make it quick. And this is one of the things that I think will have really frustrated Beijing. The idea that this war with their partner, Russia, involved, has taken over a year, and shows no signs of ending. That's problematic from Beijing's point of view. It's problematic because it keeps bringing the attention back to what China's going to do, which they don't want to have to talk about. It also disrupts global trade. It also provides a whole variety of ways in which essentially Russia isn't a useful partner to China, while it's isolated from much of the rest of the global international order. But I said there are opportunities, and I think there are. For a start, fossil fuels are now flowing at quite, I think, advantageous prices to China, which of course means that their own economic recovery after COVID is given a fairly assured sense of being fueled in the short term. China, like the rest of the world, is looking to move towards green growth, but that's not going to happen instantly. So the fossil fuels are useful. In addition, there's a very strong sense, and I think that Chinese policymakers say this very quietly, if at all, but a sense that Russia is more vulnerable to China's geopolitical aims. So to give one example that I think is already quite apparent, in areas like Central Asia, where actually China and Russia have had a bit of a rivalry, I think the economic and strategic interests of China are going to become more powerful than those of Russia, simply because China is now in a better position to tell Russia what it wants to happen.
Let's have a little history here about Russia and China's relationship. Following Mao Zedong's takeover of the country in 1949, China became a friend of the Soviet Union, the great communist power during the Cold War. Thus, they were both allies against the West in that battle. But differences emerged following the death of Joseph Stalin, with Nikita Khrushchev pursuing a move of de-Stalinization in Moscow. Chairman Mao saw that as revisionism, a changing of Marxist orthodoxy. With the Sino-Soviet split, Beijing and Washington reached out to one another, with Richard Nixon making his famous visit to China in 1972. However, under Xi Jinping, since 2012, Russia has once again become a key ally. Well, China and Russia they've always had a bit of distrust going back to the Cold War. But I guess back then, it was the Soviet Union who was the big player. Is it very much now that China sees itself as the big player?
I think in the present day, there's certainly a real fear in Russia, and you can see plenty of Russian thinkers, political analysts, who actually write pretty openly that they're worried about being swallowed up by China. The relationship between the two, certainly over the last century or more, in some ways actually is very, very ambiguous and ambivalent, because at one level, the Russians actually taught the Chinese communists everything they needed to know. It was the Russian Revolution of 1917 that inspired the first communists, people like Mao Zedong, who've gone to become, of course, Chairman Mao. And during the 1950s and 60s, people in the generation, not of Xi Jinping, but of his dad, Xi Jinping, would have actually read Russian literature, learned from Soviet thinkers. In other words, Russia really was the mentor. That really switched during the Cultural Revolution of the 60s, when China and Russia were isolated from each other. The two countries nearly actually went to war in 1969 over border islands on the Ussuri River. And by the time the relationship got somewhat mended and patched up in the 1980s and 90s, well, we know the story. China began to take off like a rocket when it came to economics, and Russia fell in, or the Soviet Union collapsed as a state, and post-Soviet Russia came into that state that we now know, in which it never seemed to find its feet economically or politically, and eventually fell under the rule of Putin, who has had to resort essentially to a war of invasion to try and boost his own nationalistic story, something which I think the Chinese, at some level, find really an argument of desperation, since they still see themselves, of course, as on the up in geopolitics, whereas asked privately, I think they would regard Russia as a state that is perhaps slowly but surely on the down escalator.
In some ways, when, especially in the Western world, the academic world, the journalistic world, reads China, especially since the Party Congress last year, we put too much emphasis on Xi Jinping's centrality to where China is today, or not?
I think it's important to think of him as someone who has made the weather, but he is not the totality of the climate system, if you want to put it that way. So someone like Xi Jinping undoubtedly has brought more personal rule to most of China's major institutions than either Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin, his two immediate predecessors. So that means, for instance, the army is supposed to be very firmly under Xi Jinping's control. Also, of course, we looked at the Party Congress of last October, where, apart from Xi himself getting an unprecedented third term at the top in the Politburo Standing Committee, he brought in basically 6 others who are very much people attached to his rule. So the personal rule is real, but it's important to remember that an awful lot of people broadly in China do share that broader vision that China has been hiding its light under a bushel and that it's time to make its way in the world. The one exception that I think we've recently seen that gave Xi some pause for thought was, of course, the COVID regulations. And those did change very suddenly last autumn, as we know.
Talking about that, zero COVID policy, which was so central to his thinking and his premiership for the last few years. And it was very much, China can handle this virus in a way that, especially under Trump, the Americans couldn't. When we saw that U-turn, how has he played that?
If we ask the question today, sitting here, February 2023, is Xi Jinping perhaps more assured in his position than he would have been 3 or 4 months ago? I think there's a plausible answer that is yes. The reason being that it was very clear that one of the things that was really stoking up anger in China's middle class was the idea that these lockdowns were going to be endless, that they would be locked in their apartments or unable to move around, unable to go overseas for months and months, years and years. And for China's middle class, which, as we know, has been growing, exponentially really over the last few decades, who are used to foreign holidays, used to sending their kids to international universities for education, COVID lockdowns cut back against that. So by deciding to, first of all, in October, to put in a top leadership that basically is very much his men in command. And I say men because the last woman on the wider Politburo was removed from office during that, retired from office, I should say, rather than forcibly removed. But no women have come in at the top level to replace her. So his men are there in charge. And now, of course, at least in the short term, of course, many people who've lost elderly members of the family from COVID are in mourning. But many more middle-class people in China are now going back to life as it was before the pandemic. And I think in terms of satisfaction from the wider public, that probably makes his position stronger.
Is the idea, therefore, that not only are they willing to listen when there are protests, which are very rare, but also that there might be more of a debate which actually goes on within Xi Jinping and his inner circle?
Well, first of all, protests are not rare in China. They actually happen very, very frequently, but most of them are localized and have to do with some particular grievance, which is usually sorted out by local government. What was rare about last autumn was that people used social media to link their message, in this case, the anti-COVID lockdown, anti-zero COVID message, from city to city. And I think that's one of the things that probably gave pause for thought. But in the question of flexibility and pragmatism of the party, I think we have to balance two things, both of which are true. On the one hand, the party is perfectly capable of changing its core ideology in terms of how it acts at really quite short notice and with tremendous willingness to move beyond accepted boundaries. So, if you look over the last three-quarters of a century, Chinese Communist Party comes into power as a Soviet-style command economy. It has 10 years of Cultural Revolution, which is essentially a form of anarchy, in a sense, you might say. Then Deng Xiaoping in the 80s turns it into a socialist-led capitalist economy, which is essentially what it is today. Today, it's basically, in 2002, Jiang Zemin said capitalists are now welcome inside the party. So all of those ideological shifts have been within the same one-party system. But the one thing that remains absolutely constant is that the Chinese Communist Party considers itself to have the destiny of ruling China that cannot be challenged and cannot be altered.
Is the more worrying long-term trend, which has come from those lockdowns, has been the fact that China's economy has stalled in terms of growth? And there is an idea now that it may not overtake America as soon as one expected.
I think the question of statistics and comparisons are only as important for China as the leadership want them to be, for two reasons. Number one is that, of course, they control all the organs of propaganda. So if they just want to never talk about beating America's economy again, they don't have to. Just as the words zero COVID have essentially been removed from the Chinese media sphere within the space of just a few weeks, you just won't find them. And that essentially the damage that's been done to China's economy from a variety of factors may make it difficult to actually overcome the United States. Reminded of those factors. In the short term, of course, the effect of the COVID pandemic, where small and medium enterprises, things like travel agencies, small restaurants, businesses, part of the motor that essentially had kept China's capitalist miracle going, those were all incredibly badly hit by the pandemic, and they're only slowly recovering now. But also there are longer-term factors. China's demographics are really very, very worrying for the leadership because, and indeed for China's people, because the one-child policy, which operated for 3.5 decades, which essentially, wasn't universal, but it was very widely spread, that has essentially meant that China is, well, to give a statistic that I think gives the illustration, if things carry on a straight line from where they are now, right now something like 100 working-age Chinese support 25 retired-age Chinese, so it's still quite a high proportion. If you go in a straight line to potentially the end of this century, which, in statistical terms isn't that far away, it'll be exactly reversed with something like 100 retirees having to be supported off the back of 25 working-age Chinese. Clearly not sustainable, but it's not clear, other than raising pension ages, maybe thinking about, new forms of industrial technology, how that's going to be dealt with. So all of those things could be holding China back, particularly since, of course, the United States has its own economic problems, but there's no reason that growth there should stop. So the US will keep growing as well. So I think it's still an open competition at the moment as to who is the world's number one GDP, let's say, by the middle of the century.
Now, before we talk about US-China relations, one big issue that's come to the fore between the two powers recently is actually COVID once more, in particular, the origins of it. The FBI director said that the organisation believed that a lab leak in China was, quote, the most likely source of the virus. That followed reports that another US federal body, the Department of Energy, had concluded, with low confidence, that the virus was accidentally leaked. Now, the White House said there was no consensus across the US government on the source of COVID. But clearly this is another area where some parts of the US system are pointing the finger at China. The Foreign Ministry in Beijing responded to the accusation by stating that US intelligence had a history of fraud and deception. And this, of course, all comes just weeks after that recent spy balloon drama. And I spoke about that with Rana Mitter. Xi Jinping and Beijing wants to have a new rules-based global order where it is a rival power to Washington. And a lot of what we talk about now is about that conflict between Beijing and Washington. And we saw it recently come to quite a bizarre head with balloons, with the Americans accusing the Chinese of having a spy balloon over their northern states in terms of Montana, and it was eventually shot down in the Atlantic. What does that tell you about the state of relations between Washington and Beijing. Obviously, Antony Blinken cancelled his trip to Beijing.
I think there are some things that are worrying and some things that are reassuring, Kiran, about what's happened the last few weeks over those issues. I mean, it's worth noting, for instance, that although Antony Blinken's visit to Beijing was called off, nonetheless, American and Chinese senior officials did meet on the fringes of the Munich Security Conference just a few days later. And so it's not as if there's no conversation between the two. There's still, I think, also an open jury as to what on earth was going on with that balloon appearing over Montana at that point. I think there's almost zero chance that the Chinese leadership would have decided to, mess up their own long-arranged visit. So that we have to perhaps say that perhaps it was a genuine error rather than actually a conspiracy. But the bigger question actually is of course the important thing. What is happening with US-China relations? Well, there are dialogues and there are more conversations happening on both sides than was the case during perhaps the last couple of years, I think, of the Trump administration. And the Biden administration has been keen both to make it clear that it's not going to back down in the face of what it regards as Chinese confrontation, but it doesn't want to stop dialogue either. I think Taiwan, though, which you mentioned, is probably what you might call the fork in the road issue. If essentially the Taiwan question is managed, and they're essentially meaning managed in the sense that there's no conflict that breaks out or no kind of zero-sum confrontation over it, then most of the other things that trouble the two sides, including things like technology transfer, accusations of unfair trade on both sides, all of those things can be reduced. But if there is a confrontation over Taiwan, it doesn't necessarily have to be a war. It could be, say, a naval blockade in the Taiwan Straits by China, which leads to sanctions by major Western economies and Japan. That will produce, potentially a global recession that makes the Ukraine war look like, a really very trivial undertaking. The likelihood, I think, largely for economic reasons, is still low. But the point is that it's not zero.
Is either side not playing this well in terms of avoiding that war? I mean, in the past few months, you saw Nancy Pelosi, the former House Speaker, go. Other, congressional delegations have gone to Taiwan.
Well, I think the Americans and Chinese both have to take some responsibility, but in both cases, there are things they can do to try and calm the temperature. In the case of the United States, I think it probably is not always helpful that very high-level officials are going in a very high-profile way, but going to make a point about geopolitical tensions may actually, ironically, exacerbate those tensions, and a bit of restraint can, I think, sometimes be helpful. But we need to point out that China also needs to lower the temperature. The sending of fighter jets across the skies near Taiwan, the operation of naval vessels. Essentially, all of these things are, a bit over the top when it comes to the fact that Taiwan itself is, of course, no threat to China whatsoever. There's no suggestion that Taiwan is in any position to do any harm to the mainland.
Now, when it comes to China's military capabilities, this week it was announced at the National People's Congress that defence spending will rise by more than 7% this year in Beijing. And during his speech, the outgoing Premier of China, Li Keqiang, said the nation must comprehensively strengthen training in preparation of a war. And a spokesperson for the Communist Party of China said increased spending was appropriate given the international circumstances. Of course, China's military spending is far below that of the United States, but it has grown considerably over the past decades. In terms of a lot of the discussion around Taiwan and a possible invasion, etc., how much do you think that is actually overblown?
I think what it illustrates, Kiran, is that neither side still has a terribly clear idea of either what the other side thinks or what they themselves think. It is in flux at the moment. And I would say that if you think about the effects, I think an invasion of Taiwan in the classic sort of D-Day sense, landing on the beaches, most military analysts still think that actually would be very, very hard for anyone to do because of Taiwan's topography, its tides, other things we don't need to go into huge detail on, but it's not an easy call. That's why the idea of a naval blockade in the Straits is one that actually has been talked about a bit more. But that would be seen as an act of confrontation in its own right if China were to do that. So we shouldn't underestimate the importance of that. If we think for a moment, though, of what it would mean, there'd be a whole variety of areas, essentially, of China's economy that would suffer very badly because of sanctions that would be imposed. Global supply chains, which may be somewhat decoupling, as they say, from China, but still are very closely linked to China, would be heavily disrupted. The semiconductor chip factories in Taiwan, which has now become quite well known, are really the only global source, at least for a few years, of the really highest quality semiconductor chips. That would almost certainly be destroyed or disrupted, throwing the global economy into a situation which would take years to recover. Both China and the United States and the rest of the world are aware of all of those results that might come from a confrontation over Taiwan. And I still think that overall, that does point towards a reason why all sides are still more likely to try and find ways to have dialogue and manage the situation.
Is it very much that we are very far away from a new Cold War, a new era of Chinese and American spheres of influence?
I don't think Cold War, even now, is quite the right phrase to use, because essentially the classic Cold War involved confrontation over a whole variety of political and military issues, but very little economic interaction. Two academics in the States have come up with a phrase which has become, I think, widely used and has some value to it, which is weaponized interdependence. In other words, with China, the United States, and the Western world can't live without each other, can't live with each other. The problem is that we have to live with each other. And I think that the understanding of the economic interdependence between the two sides is not a recipe that the two sides will never have a conflict, because, of course, we know from World Wars I and II that countries can be very entwined and still have major ideologically based conflicts. But it is a sign that actually in the world that we live in now, the effects of that in relationship essentially coming under fire would be much more devastating than anything we'd seen even, I'd say, half a century or a century ago.
Rana Mitter, thank you very much for talking to me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kiran.